The first thing you notice is the weight. A Matryoshka doll is always heavier than it has any right to be. And the weight is the first signal that you are holding a secret. Ask a Russian where the Matryoshka comes from, and the answer arrives with the confidence of the ancient. From the people, from the countryside, from time before memory, from the deep Russian soul itself. The answer is wrong. The Matryoshka doll was invented in 1890, which makes it younger than the photograph and roughly contemporary with the bicycle. And it was invented at a craft workshop outside Moscow, funded by a railroad magnate who had become worried about the disappearance of traditional Russian folk arts under the pressure of industrialization. The craftsman Vasily Zvyazdotchkin and the painter Sergei Malyutin created the first set of nesting figures in Russia. What is interesting is the thing that inspired them, because it was Japanese. The histories differ on who had brought back from Honshu a set of nesting wooden figures depicting Fuku Rokuju, the Japanese god of wisdom and longevity. The one with the elongated head that bulges upward, as if the accumulated knowledge inside it has physically enlarged the skull. Fuku Rokuju is old and serene in the way that only deities who foresee the future can afford to be serene, and his figure nested a series of smaller versions of himself inside it, each one containing another, down to the small, dense core. Malyutin looked at this and saw a form that could become Russian. He replaced the round elderly deity with a round young peasant woman in a headscarf and a sarafan dress, named her Matriona, a name derived from the Latin for mother, and voila. Russia had a new, ancient tradition. The layers of irony here are as nested as the doll. An object that has become the primary symbol of Russian national identity, arrived from Japan, was invented by people trying to rescue a folk tradition that had zero history of producing this form, and took less than a generation to become inseparable from the culture it had always supposedly expressed. Russia performed a cultural digestion so complete that the origin dissolved into the thing itself. The Matryoshka is Russian the way all the best Russian things are, by the sheer force of the claim. The Japanese tradition that inspired the form carries a philosophy inside it that the Russian version inherited, free of fully adopting, and that nonetheless shaped the object's meaning at a level too deep for adoption or rejection to reach. Fukurokuju belongs to a world where the self is understood as layers. The outermost layer is the face presented to the world, the decorated surface, the performed identity, the headscarf and the rosy cheeks. Peel that back and there is another self, slightly smaller, slightly less adorned, slightly more private. And inside that, another, the self you show only to people you trust completely. And inside that, the self you barely admit to yourself, until you arrive at the irreducible core that is the thing you actually are when everything removable has been removed. This is a Buddhist topology of personhood, and it is far from the Christian one Russia officially held. In the Christian framework, the soul is singular and indivisible, a kernel of divine light that is either saved or lost as a whole. The Matryoshka proposes a more complicated picture, that personhood is a nested sequence, that what looks like a unified self is actually a series of selves, and that the most essential one is the hardest to reach. What is remarkable is how naturally this proposition grafted onto Russian sensibility. The babushka, the grandmother figure at the center of so much Russian domestic and emotional life, is already a type of Matryoshka. She has been young, and has been middle-aged, and has raised children who raise children, and she carries all of those versions of herself simultaneously. And the children she carried are nested inside her, in the most literal possible sense. The Japanese toy arrived in Russia and met an archetype that was waiting for it. Within a generation, the foreign form had become the perfect Russian symbol. Because the perfect Russian symbol was always going to be a woman who contains multitudes. 70 kilometers northeast of Moscow, the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius rises from the town of Sergiev Posad, in gold domes and white walls that have been drawing pilgrims for 6 centuries. Around this spiritual centre, there accumulated, over those centuries, an economy of devotional craft. Icons, carved crosses, wooden toys sold to pilgrims for their children. When the Matryoshka arrived, this town absorbed it with the ease of a tradition that already knew how to make sacred things out of wood. The painters who came to the Matryoshka from the Sergeyev Posad tradition brought with them a fluency that the factory production that came later could replicate in form, but fell perpetually short of in spirit. These were people trained in the representation of sacred faces, in giving a two-dimensional surface the quality of interior life that makes an icon feel like a window over a wall. When they turned this fluency toward the Matryoshka, the dolls they produced had faces with character, faces that seemed to be looking at a particular point, overperforming a generic cheerfulness, faces that felt inhabited. What the craft at its height understood, and what the Soviet factory system that swallowed Sergeyev Posad consistently missed, is that the Matryoshka's value lives completely in the specificity of the hand that made it. Each doll in a well-made set should feel like a portrait, the largest one the public face, the subsequent ones progressively more interior, more private, more naked of ornament, until the smallest figure is as plain as a thought you have kept perpetually interior. The mass-produced version gets the shape right and loses this completely, which is why holding a tourist market Matryoshka and holding a Sergeyev Posad original feel like two different experiences. Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian literary theorist who spent his life thinking about the multiplicity of voices inside a single person, might have found the Matryoshka a more useful metaphor than any he found in language. His great argument was that the self is a conversation over a unified speaker, but a conversation, an argument, often, between multiple voices, each one with its own logic and its own claim on the person who houses them. Dostoevsky's characters, whom Bakhtin loved and studied with the intensity of a man trying to understand his own insides, are all Matryoshkas. The outermost figure is their social self, the one who navigates the world with varying success. And inside that is the self they admit to themselves, and inside that, the self they hold back from admitting. And at the core, the thing that drives everything and resists being reached or reasoned with, only felt arriving in the chest at sunrise. The Soviet state discovered the Matryoshka early and recognized in it, with the pragmatic eye that Soviet cultural policy brought to everything, an object of considerable utility. Here was a thing that looked ancient and was Russian and was cheerful and could be mass-produced and travelled well in luggage. It became a cultural export almost immediately, deployed at international exhibitions as evidence of the richness of Soviet folk tradition, the vitality of Soviet craft, the rosy-cheeked health of the peasant women who were simultaneously being driven into collective farms and dying in the famines of the early 1930s, in numbers the state declined to make public. The mass production that followed performed exactly the operation that mass production always performs on craft. It preserved the form and evacuated the content. The faces became standardized. The same proportions repeated across millions of units, the same arrangement of flowers on the same sarafan, the same expression of approved cheerfulness worn by every woman in the series, from the grandmother scale outermost doll to the smallest figure inside. The dolls were recognizable as Matryoshkas. They were recognizable as very little else. This is the characteristic tragedy of Soviet folkcraft. Less the destruction of the form, which the state actually promoted, but the destruction of the conditions under which the form had ever meant anything. You can reproduce a shape. The attention that made the shape worth reproducing is independent of the shape and does refuse to transfer. The Sergeyev Posad dolls of the Stalin era sat in their crates and their souvenir shops as perfect imitations of the thing they used to be, which is the saddest position available to an art form. The political Matryoshka appeared almost the moment the Soviet Union ended, and its arrival was one of the more elegant pieces of visual thinking that the post-Soviet period produced. The structure of the doll, each leader opening to reveal the previous one nested inside, turned out to be a perfect formal argument about the structure of Russian history. You hold Gorbachev in your hands. You twist him open and Brezhnev is inside. Brezhnev opens onto Khrushchev, Khrushchev onto Stalin, Stalin onto Lenin, Lenin solid, smallest, unpainted, unanalyzable, at the center of everything. The argument the structure makes is the argument that every political satirist in the post-Soviet period was trying to make in words. That each Russian leader is the outermost expression of a pattern that runs all the way back to the inviolable core. That what changes is the decoration, and what persists is the architecture. That the solid figure at the center of Russian power has a name that predates all the names on the outer dolls. This is history as a theory of containment. Each era holds the previous era inside it. The contemporary moment is the most elaborately decorated and least essential layer. The oldest and smallest figure is the permanent condition. The toy that was designed to show a grandmother containing her daughters and granddaughters turned out to be equally adept at showing a political tradition containing all of its own variations. And the image was so clear and so immediately legible that it asked zero explanation of the viewer. A child could understand the argument, which meant the argument had the reach of childhood, which is close to the reach of myth. Every country exports a version of itself in the objects it sells to visitors, and the version is always aspirational, the face the country has decided to wear for strangers. The Matrioshka is Russia's chosen face, which makes it worth examining the way you would examine a self-portrait. The doll is warm, domestic, and closed. Its colours are saturated and inviting. Its surface is elaborately decorated and offers immediate access. "Look at me," the painted dress says. "I am beautiful and comprehensible." But the interior is a private matter. Access requires effort, requires the decision to reach for the equator and twist it open. And the interior, once accessed, leads to another interior that requires another decision. And the decisions go on until you reach the core that stops you. The core offers zero further access. If you are inclined to read national personality into souvenir objects, and you should be at least a little inclined, because the choice of souvenir is always deliberate, then the Matrioshka is a recognizable description of a particular social manner. Warm at the surface, hospitable, rich with external expressiveness. And inside, a series of receding privacies that open only under particular conditions, each one more closely held than the last, with a center that opens to zero. Anyone who has tried to make close friends in Russia, or tried to understand Russian political behavior, or tried to read a Russian novel all the way to its last page and feel that they have understood what it was doing, will recognize this description. Whether the souvenir reveals the culture or merely flatters the tourist's existing notions is a question the doll holds inside it alongside everything else. The concept of the Russian soul, the dusha, is the single most overworked idea in the Western imagination of Russia, deployed constantly to explain literature and music and drinking habits and political behavior and capacity for suffering and capacity for joy, usually in the same paragraph. It functions as a type of explanation that resolves zero, a container word for everything that feels culturally particular and resistant to description, which makes the Matrioshka the perfect material emblem for it. The doll holds everything and resolves zero. Its surfaces are warm and bright and accessible, and its interior keeps retreating as you reach into it, each layer revealing another layer until you arrive at the solid core that you can hold in your palm but peer into zero. The Russian soul as object, as toy, as thing you can give a child, what the doll knows that the concept lacks. The center has a particular weight. The smallest figure is the heaviest for its size. This is physics. The solid wood is denser than the hollow wood of the outer dolls. And it is also the formal argument of the entire object made literal. The innermost self is the most substantial one, the one that weighs the most in the hand, the one that all the elaborately decorated outer selves exist to carry and protect. Dostoevsky knew this. His characters are all structured this way. The public self, the private self, the barely admitted self, and at the center, the thing that drives everything. the solid, unpaintable figure that resists all explanation and simply is what it is. Tolstoy knew it differently, arriving at the same centre by a different route. Through the body, over the psyche. Through physical sensation over moral anguish. The Matrioshka accommodates both approaches. It is the Russian novel in 3 dimensions, reduced to the size of a fist. In Sergiev Posad and in the villages of the Nizhny Novgorod region, there are people who make Matrioshka dolls the way they were made before the factory arrived. Their numbers are small, and their economics are precarious, in the way that real craft economics are always precarious. The market is flooded with imports that replicate the appearance of the form at a fraction of the price, and the difference between an import and a handmade original is invisible to anyone who approaches the object purely as a souvenir. It becomes visible the moment you pick one up. What the serious makers understand that the factories miss is that the doll is a portrait before it is a type. Each face should be particular. The grandmother doll should look like a particular woman who has lived a particular life. The series within the series should feel like a progression through time. The same woman, younger and younger as you go deeper in. The bones consistent across the decades, but the expression shifting. The ornament simplifying as you move toward the centre. Toward the version of herself she was before the world had fully formed her into anything. A doll made this way is a different object than a doll made as a repetition of a template. It is denser with meaning, the way some rooms are denser with the feeling of the people who have lived in them. The Russian craft scholar Elena Polyakova described the best Matryoshka painters as people who had absorbed the grammar of Russian folk ornaments so deeply they could improvise within it, who could make each dress a new composition while remaining recognizably inside the tradition, the way a great musician improvises inside a form. At the highest level, the craft becomes indistinguishable from art in the only sense that matters. The object carries the attention of the person who made it and transmits that attention to the person who holds it, and the transmission is wordless, and it is real. At the far end, the smallest figure. Smooth, unpainted, barely shaped. A suggestion of a human form, over a full rendering of one. She is the one that carries all the others inside her when the doll is assembled. She is also, paradoxically, the plainest, the one with the least to show and the most to be. In Russian folk belief, she is the soul, the core that persists beneath all the accumulated selves of a life. In Buddhist thought, which gave the doll its original form, she is the unchanging self beneath the changing selves, the Atman that watches all the decorated outer selves come and go, free of changing itself. In child psychology, she is the secure base, the internal permanence that allows the outer selves to take risks and make mistakes and keep going. Russia is enormous, and enormous countries develop regional vocabularies for everything, including wooden women. The Matryoshka made in one part of the country looks sufficiently different from the Matryoshka made in another that to set them side by side is to understand that the form, despite appearing to be a single thing, is actually a family of related objects with different temperaments. These are dialects of the same language, and like all dialects, they carry in their particulars the history of the places that produced them. The timber industry of Semyonov that gave its craftspeople access to large quantities of cheap wood, and a commercial pressure toward volume and impact. The smaller village economy of Polkov Maidan that rewarded attention to detail in the absence of competing markets. The form bent to circumstance, as forms do, and circumstance made it into multiple things that all answer to the same name. Among the many things the Matryoshka knows that it has received rare invitation to articulate is this. It depicts only women. The series within the series is always female. The grandmother contains the mother, contains the daughter, contains the child, and every figure in the sequence is a woman. And 0 male figures appear anywhere in the traditional form, which is unusual for an object so deeply associated with national identity. This matters more than it might appear to. The Matrioshka is a theory of lineage that passes completely through women, and it corresponds to a biological reality that patrilineal inheritance has always tried to suppress. The body that carries the next generation is female, and the body that carries the next body is also female, and the chain of physical continuity that connects any living person to all their ancestors is a chain of women's bodies, each one containing the next. The Matrioshka depicts this chain. The grandmother is literal. She is literal. She carried these people. They lived inside her. There is a version of the Matrioshka's meaning that becomes available only through the experience of pregnancy, and it is the version that feels most physical and least metaphorical. The Matrioshka contains smaller versions of itself. A pregnant woman contains a person who, if female, already contains all the eggs she will ever have, meaning that a pregnant woman contains her daughter and her daughter's children simultaneously. 3 generations nested inside 2 bodies. This biological fact carries the structure of a Matrioshka, which may be part of why the doll feels to many women less like a symbol and more like a description. The Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva, who spent her life in various forms of exile, and whose relationship to her own body and her children was among the most complicated in the literary record, wrote about time as a force that moved through women over remaining past them, a force the female body participated in differently than the male body, because the female body was the site where the next generation was formed and carried. She had zero explicit Matryoshka in mind when she wrote this, as far as the biographical record shows. But the idea fits the object with such precision that the absence of the explicit connection feels like an accident of chronology. The Matryoshka travelled beyond Russia long before it became a souvenir industry. It went first in luggage, carried by people who were leaving and wanted to take a piece of the place they were leaving with them. And the luggage of people leaving under duress, the emigrations of the revolution, the relocations of the war years, the careful departures of the Soviet period, is always weighted with objects that have been chosen for their density of meaning over their practical value. There are accounts from Russian Jewish emigrants of the early 20th century who brought Matryoshkas to New York and to Buenos Aires and to Tel Aviv, who kept them on shelves in apartments in languages they were learning their way through, who gave them to children and grandchildren as a way of handing a piece of the unreachable distance across the ocean. The children and grandchildren who received them were Russian in zero meaningful practical sense. They grew up in American English, in Argentine Spanish, in the Hebrew of a new country. But the doll sat on the shelf and was Russian, and its Russianness was a type of information that persisted across the translations of immigrant life. There is a philosophical problem the Matryoshka presents that zero actual Matryoshka resolves, which is the problem of the final figure. It is solid, it opens to zero, it is the end. But the logic of the series, each figure containing a smaller version of itself, implies that the smallest doll should also contain a smaller version, and that version should contain a smaller version, and so on forever. The series continuing at scales too small to see, the nesting going on at the level of cells and molecules and atoms, the Russian peasant girl all the way down into physics. Mathematicians recognize this as an infinite regress. And infinite regressions are uncomfortable because they challenge the assumption that things have a bottom. That if you keep going inward, you eventually arrive somewhere admitting zero further division. The Matryoshka's final figure is an assertion that such a bottom exists. The series stops here. This is the irreducible unit. Below this, zero further. This is one of the oldest and least resolved arguments in philosophy. Whether the universe has a flaw, whether matter has an ultimate constituent below which the concept of smaller ceases to apply, whether the self has a core that is free of being composed of nested selves. The Matryoshka takes a position on this argument. It asserts a flaw. The smallest doll is smooth and solid and complete, and the assertion it makes, that the series ends, that there is a self below which selfness ceases to nest, is an assertion of remarkable metaphysical confidence. The toy believes in the irreducible. It makes this belief available to a child's hands. Whether the belief is correct is a question that the toy has zero answer for, because it is made of wood and has already done everything it can do. The question carries on past the wood, past the shelf, into the region where only philosophy lives. Internal family systems therapy. A psychological approach developed by the American therapist Richard Schwartz in the 1980s is built on a proposition that every practitioner of IFS will tell you sounds strange until you feel it in your body, and then sounds obvious. That the self is composed of distinct parts, each with its own voice and its own history and its own claim on the person's behaviour. And that what psychotherapy is doing, in the most fundamental sense, is facilitating a conversation between these parts. Schwartz took zero explicit Matrioshka as his organising metaphor, but his patients did. The image that people in IFS therapy return to repeatedly, the image that helps them feel in their bodies what the framework is proposing, is of nested figures. A self that contains subselves, each one housed inside the others, each one carrying its own history and its own wounds and its own survival strategy. Each one legible as a version of the person who is lying on the therapist's couch, trying to understand why they keep doing the thing they keep doing. The protector parts that sit at the outside, managing the person's presentation to the world, correspond to the outermost doll, elaborately decorated, facing outward, carrying the full weight of the public self. The exiles, the parts that carry old pain and have been hidden away and forbidden access to daylight, correspond to the interior dolls, the ones that are smaller and plainer and more vulnerable and held in by the parts that surround them. And at the centre, in Schwartz's model, is what he calls the self with a capital letter, the core presence that is distinct from the parts themselves, but the witness to all the parts, the one who holds them all free of being overwhelmed. The smallest doll, the Matrioshka as a therapeutic object, is more than a metaphor. It is a physical model of the internal landscape that IFS tries to map. And giving a client a Matrioshka and asking them to handle it and open it and feel the weight of each nested figure has been reported by multiple IFS practitioners as a way of making legible through the hands a structure that is otherwise purely verbal and therefore easily evaded. The body knows the structure when the hands demonstrate it. The mind catches up.
Russian fairy tales have always been Matryoshkas.
This is formal as much as metaphorical. The Russian fairy tale tradition, the skazki that have been collected and recollected since Afanasyev's great compilation in the 19th century, is full of nested narratives. Stories that begin with a frame and then open into another story and then open into another. The narrative nesting its own versions inside itself, the way the doll nests its physical ones. The hero goes on a journey and finds himself inside a narrative within the narrative. A story about someone who had a story about someone. The whole thing structured like a series of containers, each one holding a smaller and more essential version of the truth the story is trying to tell. The character of Koshai the Deathless, the immortal villain of the Russian fairy tale world, is himself a Matryoshka puzzle. His death is hidden inside an egg, inside a duck, inside a hare, inside a chest buried under an oak tree on an island in the sea. To kill him, you have to open him, layer by layer, through increasingly impossible containers, until you find the innermost thing, the egg, inside which the needle that is his death is concealed. The structure is exact. A being who appears inviolable and complete is actually a series of nested containers, and the truth about him, the thing that can end him, is at the centre.